one person I'd like to call out for a special thank you, Jan Scheppel. Jan is a dairy farm woman and agricultural journalist of probably almost 40 years experience, close to. Jan does a lot of writing for me. She also cleans up the copy and eliminates the four-letter words on rare occasions when they appear. And she, in my opinion, is one of the best. I've known Jan for at least since the mid-'80s, and she's always been one of my favorite ag journalists because this is not, writing about agriculture is not just a theoretical experience for Jan. She and her husband Jim live it every day. And Jan, thank you. And you'll see in the November, I can't believe it's November already, issue, Jan just did a Herculean amount of work in that issue, and she's good. I thank you. I'm blessed with contributors. So, where to start? I guess, for starters, this is an historic day in the history of the United States dairy industry. Biggest bankruptcy ever. Dean Foods, the dust is still flying through the air, but Dean Foods is the nation's largest fluid milk processor, probably processing 25 to 30% of all fluid milk in the country. And this one was predictable. It was a matter of time, and unfortunately. So that's for the bankruptcy courts and plenty of lawyers to figure out, and we'll see where it all ends up. When I was a kid, between ages 2 and 5, my parents we lived on a other half of a two-family dairy farmhouse just outside of town in New Jersey. My brother was too young to pick on or play with, so it was hard to find amusement, and one of the things I would do is, when there was snow on the ground, tie a long rope to my sled and tie the other end of the rope to the back end of the manure spreader and get pulled out, get a free ride out and a free ride back with a little interim in between. But things like this Dean Foods bankruptcy make me realize that almost 70 years later, sometimes the view looks quite a bit the same. So pardon me that one. Okay, dairy is Wisconsin's largest agricultural industry and a key source of income, jobs, and wealth in the state of Wisconsin. We count about 7,200 Wisconsin dairy farmers at this time. In 2017, dairy, both from the farm through the supply industries to the processing plants, dairy was responsible for 157,000 jobs in Wisconsin. That year, milk income totaled $5.15 billion, and combining on-farm income and income from dairy processing plants, those figures totaled $45.6 billion, 7.1% of the state's total economy. So dairy is big, it's still big, and let's hope it. Combined dairy farm income and revenue from dairy processors in 2017 equaled $45.6 billion, and that was 7.1% of the state's entire economy. So that's a sizable chunk. California may produce more milk than Wisconsin, but Wisconsin produces more cheese. 85 to 90% of all farm milk produced in Wisconsin goes into the cheese vat. There's no other state in the country that has a greater linkage in consumers' mind's eye to a single food product than Wisconsin enjoys with its image as a cheese-producing state. I guess that's why they call us the cheeseheads. Hopefully that's respectful. Consumer demand for cheese is booming. Now, I think it was in 2017, per capita annual consumption of cheese reached 38 pounds in the United States. That means that on average, folks in the United States consume just a hair under 3/4 of a pound of cheese per week. That's pretty good. 38 pounds per capita annually, virtually 3/4 of a pound per week. Of course, there's always room for improvement on that statistic. That figure, per capita consumption, has doubled in the past 40 years since I've been producing the paper. And much of that growth in the past 40 years has been through mozzarella or pizza cheese type products. Let them eat pizza. Thank goodness for pizza. And the money is in the marketplace. U.S. government data shows that the average random weight chunk of mild cheddar cheese retails for about $5 per pound. Coming out of the back door of the cheese plant, up until the recent spike in cheese prices, the cheese plant might get $2 a pound or $2.10 a pound for cheese that is cut, wrapped, priced, and labeled with a supermarket's, all the labeling is done by the cheese plant. So miraculously, from the back door of the cheese plant to the supermarket retail shelf, a journey which sometimes may only take a few days, the value of cheese goes up 100 to 150%. And as I'll later point out, that markup means the money is there. It's just not a fair share coming back to the farmers or the cheese plant operators, as a general rule of thumb. In order to make our industry better, there are several areas that need addressing. And the first one, get more of the cheese dollar spent by consumers to come back to the farmer and the cheese plant. We need systems for better governing milk production. For too many years, dairy has made milk the way Chrysler made cars before Lee Iacocca came along. Make it first and then worry about selling it. And we got to think a little further ahead than just putting everything possible in the bulk tank. We face challenges of transitioning to the next generation. What is needed for young people who wish to farm to be able to actually farm? But in terms of aging infrastructure, the age of a lot of farm owners in Wisconsin certainly qualifies for aging infrastructure. Same for journalists, a couple of them at least. And finally, and this is very important, dairy has to clean up its act in an environmental sense. We have to be better environmental citizens moving on from here. Now, in these comments, I'm going to refer several times to wealth and differentiate between created wealth and extracted wealth. So, this symbol on the screen comes from the earliest Northern European language, Rune, R-U-N-E, and you've heard of stick people? This is a stick cow. The symbol in the Rune language in Northern Europe, again, the first recorded Northern European language, the symbol of the cow symbolizes wealth. So what we can do is go all the way back to the beginnings of recorded history and point to the cow and other livestock symbolizing wealth. Except it wasn't just a symbol, that was true wealth. And as my wife was reading through some of the details recently, the notion of mobile wealth or mobile wealth was important because if the Vikings were attacking the village next door, you could gather up your livestock and move them, and hopefully the invaders didn't grab them and feast on them. But Going all the way back to the beginnings of Western recorded history, the cow has symbolized wealth. Now, I think we need to marvel at the dairy cow's functions. She converts feed and grass into a human food, a nutritious human food that has many applications in our diets. When properly managed, her manure and urine, or to use the technical terms, poop and pee, fertilize the soil and build organic matter in the soil. She reproduces, yielding a calf almost every year. And at the end of her milking career, a 1,500-pound Holstein is going to yield somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 quarter-pound hamburgers. So the cow is a miraculous food-producing and wealth-creating machine. The cow's milking cycle begins at about 22 to 24 months of age when she has her first calf. The average cow, although Mr. Benke would, Wallace Benke here would, average cows probably look pretty non-productive to Wallace there. The average cow produces about 2,600 gallons of milk per year in a milking cycle averaging 10 to 12 months. Some cows produce more milk, some cows produce less. But putting these things in a human context, let's say we got a 1,500-pound Holstein producing 75 pounds of milk. She is metabolizing, through her consumption of nutrients and water, milk that is in weight is equal to 5% of her body weight in a given day. And if that cow is, if one of Wallace's cows is making twice as much as that, she's metabolizing roughly 10% of her entire body weight as milk in one day. That is a lot of work, I believe. 150-pound human mother who's nursing, if she were producing 5% of her body weight, she'd be producing almost a gallon of milk per day for her infant. At $18 per hundredweight, we understand the phrase cash cow. The average cow the average cow nationwide at $18 per hundredweight farm milk price will yield roughly $4,000 per year in gross revenue. Unfortunately, in recent years, gross has been red ink for the most part, not black ink. Now, unfortunately, for all our knowledge and scientific and applications of science to dairying, the modern dairy cow averages a working lifetime of a little bit less than 2 milking cycles before she passes through the golden arches. In the last several decades, going back to the 60s and 70s, I believe there's been a little bit too much overt emphasis on milk production traits in dairy genetics, less emphasis on overall hardiness and sturdiness of the animals so that they may have longer working lives. Bigger, more, better, or bigger is better, more is better, isn't always an ethic that holds true in dairy. So, milk may be processed into many tasty forms, cheese, yogurt, ice cream, butter, kefir, fluid milk, take your pick. All of the consumer dairy products we see in the supermarket are really simply variations of fat, varying ratios of fat and non-fat solids with cultures and or flavors added. Dairy proteins are complete proteins containing a full complement of amino acids. We'll get into some competing products that don't have full sets of amino acids a little later, but again, the modern array of dairy products in our supermarket shelves is diverse, nutritious, and amazing. Now, where did this all start in Wisconsin? In the decades following the Civil War, some of the deep thinkers in Wisconsin realized we're going to have a problem. The wheat belt helped feed this nation, this growing nation, but over decades the wheat belt exhausted the natural fertility of the soils. And particularly in the southern half or third of the state, the virgin timber, which helped build this nation in the second half of the 1800s and well into the 1900s, the virgin timber was being dramatically cut down. And so as the wheat belt exhausted the soil's fertility and much of the original virgin timber was gone, visionaries such as former Governor William Hord realized, holy mackerel, we're going to have a problem. So this chart shows wheat acreage versus number of dairy cows in Wisconsin, and you can see dairy cows pulled ahead of wheat acreage, at least temporarily, in the mid-1890s, and then since about 1900, there was no competition. Dairy trumped wheat. But the transition to something else, what Governor Hord and others pondered, what are we going to do for economy? We had towns, we had cities, we had rail lines, we had roads, all of which had been built, much of which had been developed and built upon the wheat and timber industries. And now, what to do? So, in my opinion, the wise forefathers of Wisconsin's dairy industry committed the greatest act of economic development in our nation's history. Again, I view Wisconsin's dairy industry's development as the greatest example of honest economic development, creating wealth of anything else that's ever happened in the United States. Now, 5 or 6 or 7 generations later, dairy remains the main cornerstone of Wisconsin agriculture, generating wealth through production of milk, production and sale of livestock, marketing of cheese and butter, and the spin-off industries such as meat processing and leather goods. The vision that came to focus of Wisconsin being well suited for dairy, particularly a dairy industry producing storable products such as butter and cheese, creating wealth from the soils, that incorporated several of the state's strengths, including soils, which needed replenishing, moisture, climate, and the livestock skills many of the northern European settlers brought to this country from their homelands in Europe. Dairy came naturally to a lot of these folks, and that's good because it was a lot of hard work. From those humble beginnings to the present, farm income for over 100 years has been the economic lifeblood of rural Wisconsin. Farm milk income, I should say, has been the economic lifeblood of rural Wisconsin. And we look at the jobs, the businesses, the related industries. All this wealth starts with the production of milk by the dairy cow and the hard work of the farmers and those who supply the farmers with necessary goods and services. Now, from the early days, the University of Wisconsin-Madison provided crucial research to help modernize the state's dairy industry, from crops and industrial processes into food science. Now, let's use the example of Dr. Stephen Babcock, who invented the Babcock Test, after whom Babcock Hall is named. No, Dr. Babcock did not invent Babcock Hall ice cream. He can't take credit for that. But he did something much more important. He invented a simple test to measure the amount of milk fat in samples of milk. That occurred in the 1890s, and over the next decade or two, the Babcock test for testing milk fat volumes was widely adopted. The importance being, back then, most farmers just sold cream and they fed the skim milk to their hogs. But prior to the Babcock test, there was no way for farmers to know whether they were getting an honest fat test from their milk buyer or an honest cream test. So Babcock's invention really put Wisconsin's dairy industry on the map. And following, as the Babcock test was applied, local co-ops were formed, local testing co-ops were formed to make sure farmers and their neighbors got fair tests and fair prices for their milk. Now, other technologies that the University of Wisconsin helped invent or propagate would be silos for storing crops for overwinter feeding, as well as promoting alfalfa. And just a real quick story. In 1934, President Roosevelt flew over the Midwest doing an aerial survey of the drought, the severe drought in 34. And when they were flying over Buffalo County near Waumendy, Roosevelt looked out the window of the plane, and instead of all the millions of acres of brown, burned, parched grass and corn crops, there was green down there. So Roosevelt, he demanded of his advisors, why is that area green down there? They didn't know. But he said, when we get back to Washington, I want to know why that area was green. And it turned out that Waumendy area had natural outcroppings of limestone, which allowed local farmers to plant clovers and alfalfa, deep-rooted crops whose roots could go way down into the subsoil and bring back moisture and thrive, unlike shallower rooted crops. So so then when it was explained to Roosevelt why it was green down there in this corner of Wisconsin, he said, can't we do that for everybody? And that led to the New Deal programs of the mid-30s and later, restoring America's soil through application of limestone and among other practices. But even though he was a rich New Yorker, Roosevelt had an eye for agriculture, and that's just one little way Wisconsin contributed to this nation's betterment. Now, let's go, milk cows. Here are numbers, historic numbers of milk cows. You can see we've flattened out at about 1.3 million in recent years. One of the points I want to make is back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we probably had close to 50% more milk cows now, but the productivity per cow today is far greater. I think it's been said the average cow today makes about 4 times as milk as the average cow did in 1950. Okay, number of dairy farms in Wisconsin historically, starting with 1920, going up to 90, then in 5-year segments, and then more recently, 1 annual segments. Our farm numbers are way down, and they are declining. And then there's milk production. Okay, milk production keeps climbing, although gently in recent years. Fewer cows than years back, but much greater productivity per cow. Here's where we get into yo-yos. Annual milk prices received by farmers up and down and up and down and up and down. The peak year being 2014. If we corrected the right-hand side of that black line, I think we'd see it scooching up nicely here at the end of 2019. And I suspect, whereas 2020, for reasons we'll talk about later, by 2020, we're going to see something that gets much closer to 2014 than we've seen in a long time. And that money is needed. Milk is going to be very tight, and our crop situation here in Wisconsin and many other states has been really challenged by the weather. So Coming out of World War I, the nation's consumer economy was hot. You know, we've all heard of the Roaring '20s. But today, 100 years later, very few people understand that the Great Depression of the 1930s started on the farm, America's farms, in August and September of 1920. During World War I, our agricultural prices had been way up there as United States farmers fed Allied nation, or well, they weren't allies till 1917, but fed certain Western European nations, and spectacular profits, higher, you know, farmers bid off debt to grow more crops, sell more crops. And during the war, we were feeding our troops and the troops and citizens of Allied nations. That continued for a couple of years after the end of World War II. But by late summer 1920, Europe was again feeding itself, and all of a sudden, our bumper crops of grain and our massive inventories of hogs and beef were not needed. Prices collapsed. Agriculture went into a depression from which it did not recover probably for 20 years, the late 30s, early 40s. But again, the depression of the 1930s started on the farm in late summer 1920. It just took a while for the agricultural pneumonia to catch everybody else. In the Depression years saw tough times on the farm. Agricultural prices collapsed further. We see here a picture of a milk strike in Wisconsin where some farmers dumped voluntarily, and they convinced by hook or crook some of their other neighbors not to market their milk. But milk dumpings, milk strikes, foreclosures, penny auctions. The 30s was tough for agriculture, including dairy. Many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of family farms were lost to foreclosure in the 20s and 30s. And then atop the economic woes of the 30s, we had the Dust Bowl. Too many grasslands in the Plains states had been converted from grass to row crops, getting rid of the natural cover of the crop, and when the weather turned unduly dry, we got the Dust Bowl. Years-long severe drought, and it caused, you know, you've seen the pictures of the Dust Bowl days, but the jet streams carried dust from the American plains as far east as Western Europe. That's how dramatic, how much soil was lost in those periods of time. Now, just to make a point, here we have number of cows, number of dairy farms in Wisconsin. You know, I'm not going to doubt the data, but I almost think that line on the cow number should be trending up a little more. Well, I guess we're good, but we see fewer cows, fewer farms, but more milk. Okay, now closer to the present. The past 4+ years, starting in early 15, have shown that man-made economics and later on ill-advised trade policies represent our biggest challenges, almost as big as some of our biggest challenges, almost as big as Mother Nature. We've seen Wisconsin farm bankruptcies spike. We've seen farmers exiting the industry. I think we've lost a couple thousand dairy producers in the last 2 years, even a few suicides. But the collapse of economics on the farms has led to the emotional collapse of many farm families, dairy farm families, who, by any measure, have been some of the world's greatest optimists. Now, consumers today. Ultimately, dairy is a consumer-driven industry, domestically and internationally. Dairy's challenge is to produce consumer products in the forms and quantities that consumers wish to buy. There's always something new. In recent decades, we've seen marketing evolutions, niche products evolve, which show us that change in the dairy case is constant. Thank you, Rachel. I'm getting a little bit hoarse there. My wife is watering me down. Some of those changes, organic. Organic dairy products today constitute a little less than 5% of total consumer dairy product sales in the country. Grass-fed. Milk, some farmers have grass-only rations for their cows. Grass-fed milk can bring a premium to the farmer. It can bring, particularly for organic producers, it can bring a premium price at retail. Health and health attributes such as higher omega-3 acids and CLAs are associated with grass-fed products, be they dairy, pork, poultry, etc. GMO-free. Some consumers don't want anything to do with genetically modified organisms. That extends to no hormones used on the cows and no genetically modified corn or soybeans in their rations. Lactose-free. Some people are intolerant of lactose products. There have been systems developed to neutralize the lactose or milk sugars so that people with lactose intolerance may comfortably drink milk. Higher fat and enhanced fat products. Now, Norm, tell me if I'm wrong, but hasn't Sassy Cow come out with a elevated fat content beverage milk? 4% instead of 3 or 3.2. Sassy Cow, the local dairy farm processor up near Columbus, has come out with a fat elevated milk, and I hope it's selling well. Jan, I think that's an article we should do soon. Not to try to preempt Brooke on that one. So. RBGH free or RBST free. The consumers' concerns about Monsanto's Posilac, the drug when injected into cows that would boost milk production 8 to 12%. A lot of consumers didn't think it was a good idea to poke cows with synthetic hormones, and that brought on the wave of products marketed to consumers with farmers certified affidavits that they did not use that drug. They weren't injecting their herds with that drug. Butter, one of our great success stories. Butter consumption has now climbed above 5 pounds per capita, and butter is growing. This is all good. Dairy suffered for decades, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, etc., through bad, fraudulent research from the University of Minnesota that alleged that animal fats in the diet were responsible for an epidemic of heart attacks in the United States. But now butter and whole milk are enjoying a resurgent sales. People are buying more butter, they're buying more whole milk. Skim milk sales are way down. People want the flavor and nutrition from higher fat dairy products. 4 or 5 years ago, there was an amazing book written titled The Big Fat Surprise by author Nina Teichholz. She researched nearly 150 years of human nutrition research on animal fat intake, going back to England in the 1840s. But what she did was exposed blatant research fraud at the University of Minnesota in the 1950s by Dr. Ansel Keys. Keys was the character who, through the alleged strength of his research and the force of his personality, helped convince the American Heart Association and the FDA that animal fats were bad in the diet. Drink skim milk, eat margarine, all that kind of logic. What Nina Teichholz, author of The Big Fat Surprise, showed was that Dr. Keys had cherry-picked his research, and that no surprise, because the manufacturer of Crisco, the vegetable shortening, was providing Dr. Keyes money. So, ironically, years later, this goes back maybe 10 years ago, the son of a deceased fellow researcher of Dr. Keyes found in his, while cleaning up his deceased father's basement, he found the original human health, animal fat, heart disease data stored on, I guess they were old discs or something, 1950s and 60s formatted human health data. So what they did was they downloaded this information, they reformatted it into modern computer systems, and then they ran modern computer analyses of the data, and son of a gun, according to the original research from Dr. Keyes, the people who had been consuming the higher levels of animal fat, meat, red meat, butter, whole milk, they actually had fewer heart attacks than the other groups in Dr. Keyes' research. But for 5 or 6 decades, dairy and red meat took a whooping because of this bogus research. Again, I noted we've doubled, in over 40 years, we've doubled our cheese consumption as a nation. Wisconsin has ridden that uptrending line vigorously. That's all to the good. And it's not just the volume of cheese, but the types of cheese. Roughly, Norm, am I correct in saying roughly 25% or more of all cheese produced in Wisconsin is considered specialty cheeses? Not lesser varieties, but more obscure varieties, perhaps, like Havarti or dill flavored products, you name it. But it's not just the specialty cheeses. That's where the money is. The higher markups for the cheese plant and the supermarket. Last 2 weeks ago, the Ag Department hosted a presentation by Sid Cook, the owner of Carr Valley Cheese. And Sid, with 4 plants and 8 retail stores and 250 retail accounts, noted how they are producing over 100 different varieties of cheese by the time you count his goat milk cheeses, his sheep's milk cheeses, and then his cheeses consisting of milk from multiple species. And the inventiveness of Mr. Cook and his staff at Carr Valley are mind-boggling. Go into one of Carr Valley's stores and do a lot of sampling. It's a tasty experience. Now, then there's something as simple as a cheese curd. Hard to believe, but outside of Wisconsin, most supermarkets don't carry cheese curds. And hard to believe, outside of Wisconsin, most restaurants don't offer cheese curds as an appetizer, or even a main course for that matter. But the bottom line is, I contend, if we marketed cheese curds nationwide the way Wisconsinites put away cheese curds, there would be a shortage of milk and a shortage of cheese, not a surplus that's plagued us for some time. And a couple months ago, Jan Scheppel did an article on the Old Fashioned restaurant on the square in Madison, which was listed as having the best cheese curds in Wisconsin. And I can say that research on the subject tends to confirm that award. It's amazing. If you ever want great cheese curds, fried cheese curds, go to the Old Fashioned. Now, okay, what intrigues me as an old aging journalist is the marriage of dairy, nutrition, and wellness. Dr. Denise Ney is a nutrition scientist and researcher at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Ney only lives about 3 miles down Highway MM. She's a local. And what I will do is explain her work developing a dairy product-based food system for people who were unable to consume normal proteins. Now, I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, but there is a disease suffered by some people called phenylketonuria. Where's Dennis? What's the proper pronunciation, Dennis?
Phenylketonuria.
Phenylketonuria. People afflicted with PKU, I'm not going to try to say that whole thing again. People afflicted with PKU cannot digest proteins. And this leads to some terrible life consequences. In the 1930s, research from the University of Wisconsin, the Weissman Institute, determined that 15 to 20% of all people in mental institutions in Wisconsin were not mentally ill, they suffered from PKU. So 80 years later, Dr. Ney, let's move to the next slide, next couple slides. Yeah. Dr. Ney isolates a whey protein which can be consumed by people and synthesized by people suffering from PKU. This led to a line of commercial products for people who suffer from that disease, and I find this an amazing example of applied nutrition with dairy in the middle of bettering people's lives. Now, it may get better. Ancillary data from her original research showed that mice fed this one whey protein suffered weight. Female mice suffered, but had weight loss, and also their bone mass density loss was not as severe. So there's now research. We'll get this. We're not ready for this one yet, but there's now research in progress trying to establish if applications of this specific whey protein will in fact lead to human weight loss and boost or at least slow the demise of or decline of bone mass density in some people. So this is applied research at its best, in my opinion. Now, okay, what if there were a dairy product that helps babies be smarter? There is. It's been found that milk fat membranes, i.e. the thin substance that surrounds a globule of milk fat, when collected and added to soy-only formulas, will boost the IQ. I can't call it IQ because at 1 year old, I'm not sure how they measure babies' intelligence, but they do somehow. The bar on the left side is the intelligence measure for 1 year olds who, for the first 6 months, were fed soy formula with enhanced by milk fat membrane globules. The middle bar is the babies who were fed the soy formula without the enhancement from milk fat membranes, and the bar on the right is for babies who were breastfed. So obviously babies who were breastfed have better, in this study, had better measures of intelligence at year 1. However, the soy-only formulas enhanced with the milk fat membranes come a pretty close second, and then we get to something similar research. Soy-only formulas with enhanced by milk fat membranes. That's the one on the left. One on the middle, soy-only formula. Bar on the right, breastfed. Now, what they did was research these three groups into the incidence of hospitalizations necessary during the first 6 months of life to treat infants for infections. And the different color coding breaks down the type of infections. But as you can see, in this case, the milk globule membrane enhanced soy formula actually came in about almost 25% of those had about 25% of the incidences of the soy-only formula in terms of hospitalizations. And infections like ear infections for youngsters that can over time impair their hearing permanently perhaps. So anything that can make healthier babies is a win-win-win situation. Particularly it's a win for dairy when we can use these fat-derived materials. Okay, and finally, A2 milk. This is one of my favorites. Centuries ago, it's believed there was a volcanic eruption that cut off a large amount of sunlight for a long time to northern Europe. And many of that lack of exposure to natural sunlight caused the casein gene in some cows, many cows of northern Europe extraction, to shift from the historic casein profile to a new casein profile. The new one is called A1. The older one is called A2. Now, it turns out that the human gut biome, our gut bacteria, research of which lags behind rumen research in dairy cows, but the human gut bacteria regard novel proteins in some cases as allergens and reject them. That's why a lot of, I won't get into that, but your body has ways of dealing with novel proteins and to reject them. And it is found that some people's gut biomes react negatively to A1, the novel protein, but they can accept the old protein variant A2. And nowhere is this more dramatic than in the Chinese population, where roughly 85% of the Chinese folks can't eat, or they're discomforted by eating dairy products, and it's believed that a large percent of that group are actually allergic to the A1 proteins. So the A2 Milk Company of New Zealand has a line of commercial products, milk processed only from cows, only from herds where all the cows have the A2 casein profile. And sales of infant formula, A2 infant formula in China for the past several years have increased by 100% year over year over year. In Australia, A2 milk has a 10 to 12% market share of all fluid milk sold at supermarkets in Australia, while carrying a 100% price premium. So there's not only nutrition advantages for A2 dairy products, there's also money in that marketplace. And interestingly, I've had several talks over the years with dairy farmers who had autistic children, and when they isolated a cow, tested a cow for the A2 traits and isolated a cow in their herd that was A2, and fed that milk to their autistic kids, the kids' behavior mellowed out. So this is amazing. I mean, again, all these applications of research and science and dairy to nutrition and human wellness. Okay, now the future. What I want to do is list a number of suggested strategies for the industry, suggested policy proposals. Folks, business as usual, the same old, the same old isn't working, and it's not going to dig us very far out of the hole without some new attitudes and practices in dairy. First of all, economic development strategies by the state, in my opinion, ought to focus on making better our core industries. Let's do better with what we got, as opposed to inviting some characters from Taiwan to build a big complex in southeastern Wisconsin. enhanced by billions of dollars of state subsidies. Let's make our dairy industry better. And how do we do that? How do we improve upon the greatest example of economic development strategy in history to make the future appropriate for the coming generations of farmers, consumers, and state residents? We can't take our heritage for granted. And then we're at a juncture in our history where we are replacing a milk price crisis. I mean, we're looking at November and December milk prices probably either at $20 a hundredweight or a little less than $20 a hundredweight for cheese milk in the federal milk order. So on one hand, the price crisis is passing, but there's a lot of pain left over from several years of low prices. On the other hand, we're now into a crisis of crops. There is such an exodus of livestock, particularly in the central part of the state, such an exodus of livestock to auction barns and then to slaughter going on because farmers don't have crops, adequate crops to overwinter their animals, that the pipeline from the auction barn to the slaughter facilities is plugged up and overwhelmed. The quality of crops, particularly hay harvested this year, thanks to a wet spring, a wet summer, and we got a little bit of break there in early September maybe, but a wet fall, the quality of hay is not going to sustain normal levels of milk production. So what do we do to do better as future strategies? Number one, capitalize on Wisconsin's high quality cheeses and optimize financial benefits so that they come back to the farmer. What I'm proposing to do is set up a farmer and cheese plant owned, call it a mail order cheese business, something like Swiss Colony on steroids, with the money coming back to the farmer and the cheese plant. Now, secondly, we need more incentives to encourage young people to come back to the farm. As I joked earlier, the average age of our dairy farmers in Wisconsin means we're aging infrastructure, aging human infrastructure, and it's not just encouraging people, whether with loans or make a statewide TIF district or something, but there has to be good reason that young people coming back to agriculture can anticipate a decent share of profitability and quality of life for the hard work that they're going to put in. It's not just getting them back to the farm, it's keeping them on the farm in good shape financially, psychologically, you name it. But we need to aggressively bring more young people back, and I'm sure Norm has a few ideas on that one. Available credit is tough to come by. I think the younger you are and the smaller you are in a relative sense, the harder it is to get credit, agricultural credit these days. But again, it's absurd to think of the billions of state subsidies that are promised to Foxconn to set up shop over in Racine County when we look at our state's agriculture, our deficient rural broadband system, our rural health care, you name it. We got a lot better ways to spend our state funds to encourage honest growth, development, and progress with what we got. Now, next subject, and I'll give Wisconsin Farmers Union credit for this suggestion as part of their policies. One of the biggest mistakes Wisconsin's ever made, in my opinion, is taking away the zoning authority for siting CAFOs or mega dairies, taking it away from the counties and towns and giving it to the state ag department. You look at the last 10 years, we've probably seen in 10, 12 years since that law went into effect in 06, we've probably seen a couple hundred mega dairies and large beef and poultry and pork operations come into the state. 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, we had more cows in Wisconsin than we do today, but we've got a heck of a lot more incidents of polluted groundwater and surface water in the state, and putting too many cows together, whether it's 1,000 or 3,000 or 8,000, putting all those cows together in one spot and expecting that there are not going to be any problems occurring with how that manure is stored and then spread. That's pretty naive. Our track record is not good, and I think that restoring to the towns and counties zoning authority on the CAFOs is one way of giving back local control. And given the experiences statewide, I suspect most localities would probably pass on such opportunities if they had the chance. Following his election last fall, Wisconsin Attorney General Call stated that under his leadership, water quality would not be a negotiable item. Good for him. We cannot keep trading off water quality for the alleged economic benefits of industry, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, whatever. But politically, if anything, the last week has showed us just how nasty this fight over addressing water quality issues and CAFO siting has been. Last week, our capable, now former Secretary designee of the State Ag Department, Brad Pfaff, was canned by the state Senate. I think Brad's sin was calling for public hearings on the requisite every fourth year review of our state's CAFO siting law. Never before had the previous administration invited public comments, and some of those public comments were compelling and indeed tear-inducing to listen to some of the experiences from folks who got stuck to living, who had a 3,000 cow dairy plunked half a mile away from them without good treatment of odors or manure management. Again, former Secretary designee Pfaff's getting canned, in my opinion, was just an example of how the Republican Senate and Assembly leaders have lined up with the big boys in agriculture who don't want the public to have a say in the matter. And then, okay, now go to the next slide. This is a State Journal article from last Saturday. Angus, can you go to the next one? Okay. This is the first and third paragraphs of that story, saying how the Lafayette County Board was considering a resolution to penalize lawmakers and criminalize journalists who didn't give the entire report on water quality issues in their reporting. Now, criminalizing reporters. Now, if you got a 100-page report on water quality and you're supposed to report the whole thing as a journalist, nobody's going to read the darn thing after about word 3,000. But the notion of criminalizing the media and criminalizing elected officials for revealing what's said in water quality reports is ridiculous. And mercifully, the part about the media, I heard on the radio tonight, the part about the media was pulled out of this proposed resolution before the Lafayette County Board. But who are the legislators in a podunk county in Wisconsin to tell the media what they can and cannot report? I mean, would they go after the New York Times? Would they go after Pravda? I don't know where their lines are drawn, but this is the two examples of this Lafayette County resolution as now amended, but also Brad Pfaff's getting fired, are examples of just how brutal the battle over determining our agricultural structure and water quality oversight are. Shocking. Okay. Another matter, and this is more industry than government, how do we regulate milk supplies? The Canadian model, Wisconsin Farmers Union did a good job in the programs a year ago in the spring, bringing Canadian speakers around the state to talk about the Canadian milk supply management programs. I don't think we can't Xerox Canada's example here, but the discussion started by the Wisconsin Farmers Union has prompted, sometimes with a cattle prod prompting, some cooperatives and private plants to address how much milk the plants can conveniently handle. Jan did a story a couple months ago about Henning cheese over near Lake Michigan. Henning cheese, when milk prices collapsed, went to its producers and said, look, don't make any more milk. We'll hold up your milk price. We'll keep your milk prices propped up to profitable or reasonable levels. And good for Henning's cheese for reaching out to its producers, good for the producers for respecting the request of their handler or their cheese plant. And they're very, very thankful bunch that they didn't suffer the downside. So maybe on a small scale, individual market basis, there are ways to address milk supplies. Now, imitators. Big brouhaha over engineered dairy and meat proteins, alleging to be milk and alleging to be meat. Example, the Impossible Burger. To make a long story short, this may appeal to all the folks who think animal agriculture is terrible and they want to vote with their food choices, but engineered proteins may well be novel proteins and rejected by the human gut bacteria. We need some very in-depth human safety studies, relevant human safety studies on these novel proteins or lab engineered proteins before people should comfortably make an impossible choice, if you will. The University of Wisconsin-Madison today, in my opinion, needs a good kick in the asterisk. The Center for Dairy Research Project, announced in 2012, is, okay, here's where they were last Thursday. 7 years after the project was announced, it looks like they may have the basement partially done. The groundbreaking was roughly 3.5 years behind schedule. The budget is now double the original budget projections. The dairy industry contributed like 16 or 18 million originally. The dairy processors, they're not giving any more money. This project is long, delayed, slow, costs going crazy. The original architect hired by the state of Wisconsin had zero experience designing a food processing facility, and it's been all downhill since there. But I fear that this effort to modernize Babcock Hall, old Dr. Stephen Babcock would probably be turning over in his grave if he knew what was going on, and really has the state's cheesemakers angry because they, old Babcock Hall was built in the 50s. Walls are crumbling. There's black mold throughout the premises. That is not the type of facility that's going to attract or keep the top researchers. It's not the type of facility that's going to attract and keep top-notch graduate students. And this is our future, our research future, which we're squandering. So finally, well, next to finally, manure. Manure is a frontier. There's the best way, in my opinion, to handle manure, and this would require statewide emphasis, is composting. Jan Scheppel's done some amazing jobs on the benefit of composting. This picture was taken at the Endress Brothers farm up near Wanakee. Under a roof, they have their manure in a long pile. That complicated machine is a manure converter. It's kind of like a a side shooting rototiller, and it just goes through and turns over the compost every so often. Composted manure weighs 40% less than regular manure. You may put it on, the farmer may apply it to his crops when weather conditions are more propitious, and the crops actually respond better to compost than regular, just old-fashioned slapping it on before you compost it. But this is the future, and in one of the upcoming issues of the Milkweed, we're going to do a story about liquid composting, whereby technology that's been researched and approved by the government simply causes bubbles of pushes oxygen down to the bottom of water-based manure storage systems. The oxygen percolates up. There is no greenhouse gas production. There is no odor. So we have dry composting, if you will, or liquid composting, but composting is the way to go to manage our manure. Very few odors, no greenhouse gas is given off. And boy, by golly, greenhouse gas, we're going to hear more and more about greenhouse gas, and dairy and livestock agriculture cannot turn their backs on being good environmental stewards in the future. I'm not big on manure digesters. This is the mistake by the lake up in, was it Vienna Township? Right next to Jan. 3 or 4 years ago, the county subsidized digester, one of the 3 digesters, blew up. A history of mechanical problems and pollution problems. Now it seems to be operating better, but to me, one of the fallacies of manure digesters is when you burn methane, produce methane and then burn it, the 2 major byproducts are water and CO2. So all we're doing is creating one greenhouse gas and burning it, and then creating another greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. Composting does not produce greenhouse gases. This is Green Bay after an April rain, I think in 2011, aerial photograph. It doesn't exactly want to make you get out your fishing pole or bathing suit. We've got to do a better job on our soil erosion. And Green Bay may be brown during the runoff period, but then it turns green with algae from the nutrients running off from fertilizers, both suburban and agricultural. It turns green, and a major part of Green Bay will turn into a dead zone each summer, oxygen depleted, levels depleted by the growth of algae. That wasn't why they called it Green Bay in the early days. I think we need to view dairy and agriculture as opportunities for addressing 3 major problems in our society: soil erosion, greenhouse gases, and also, pardon me, I'm losing my thought here. Okay, flood control, greenhouse gases, and soil erosion. If you imagine the expanse of the extended Mississippi Basin from western Pennsylvania to Montana, all that land is really a blank slate waiting to be properly managed for soil control and flood control. Every 1% increase in organic matter of soil per acre will hold an additional 16,000 gallons of water. So that's 16,000 gallons. That's roughly the equivalent of 3 big milk tank trailers we see going down the road per acre. So what can we do to the flooding downriver, the flooding problems that persist downriver with all these heavy rain events and snowmelt events, if we can cognitively encourage agriculture to boost this organic materials in the soil, cover crops, and create incentives for farmers to plant cover crops. Maybe this means shorter season corn and beans, but whatever. There are greater values to be achieved through the wise use of farmland as a flood control measure and building soil organic matter. Take the fence rows. Why not plant tens of millions or hundreds of millions of trees on the fence rows as windbreaks, but more importantly, to sequester carbon and retain moisture in the soils. We were blessed with natural resources in this country at the time the Midwest was settled, and a lot of that soil has gone south. We can't afford to lose much more soil for future generations. We can't afford this continued cycle of flooding as precipitation events become more and more dramatic. So what I would argue is that Wisconsin, in a wiser political environment than now may exist in the legislature and in the Senate and Assembly, Wisconsin has the opportunity, if we look at the future, look at our agricultural resources, and have some cognitive plans to do a better job in the future for future generations, we can set the stage for soil conservation, growing organic, increasing soil organic matter content, planting trees, and being, composting manure, and being environmental stewards, assuming our responsibilities in that department. So that's about what I had to say, and I apologize for going on and on, but I've spent my lifetime watching this industry. It's a good industry with good people, and to quote Mr. Obama, we're capable of better.